Recording in progress.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the paper Necromancy from the Antiquity to Contemporary Films. The term necromancy is a 17th century derivation from the Italian negromantia, black magic, which itself derived from the Hellenic Greek nekros manteia, divination by means of the dead. Such a practice is first mentioned by Homer in the Odyssey, when the eponymous hero makes sacrifices to summon the dead in Hades. Greek and Latin authors who describe the invocation of the dead include Herodotus, Plutarch, Horace, and Cicero, though the rituals were described vaguely, apart from the involvement of blood. Simultaneously, the practice of the oracles of the dead in the Mediterranean by the Pythagoreans and the Orphics was not considered as abhorrent, and its practitioners were not seen as the embodiment of evil. The Persians, Egyptians, Babylonians, Sabians, and Chaldeans also reported on necromancers. The associations of witches with the dead thus predates the insertion of Satan or the devil into witchcraft. The origins of necromancy themselves are, however, disputed, and there is no direct evidence about them. According to Andrei Kapkar, divination by means of the dead originated in shamanism, in which the realm of the dead is seen as the cause and the solution to present problems. The shaman has the ability to send his soul away from his body, to acquire wisdom, and to travel to remote areas or to the underworld. Kapkar also links necromancy to the cult of the ancestors, practiced since prehistory. He divides all of such practices into sympathetic and beneficial necromancy. During the Middle Ages and until the mid-15th century, the learned necromantic practitioner, intended as the person who conjured demons, was the principal focus of law and legal procedures against magic. It was an age in which rumor and suspicion were judge and executioner, when fear and loathing were law and order. Christian rulers set laws against fortune-telling, the residual pagan rituals, and poisoning, associating witchcraft with heresy. The suggestion of several authors is that during those centuries, necromancy was practiced by the members of a clerical underworld, often operating in communities rather than as single individuals. In 1485, the Malleus Maleficarum, the number 2 bestseller after the Bible until 1678, established the equivalence between witchcraft and heresy and its association with the influence of devils. According to its authors, necromancy is included in the kind of superstition known as divination, since its practitioners invoke the dead from hell, but it is devils that actually appear. As Martin Lois argues, back in the real world, it is just questions of good and evil, of natural and supernatural, which have long been at the core of our perceptions of witchcraft in our society, often with deadly consequences. Mentions of necromancy in terms of the resuscitation of the dead belonged only to literary texts until since the 18th century. In the more secular society of the 19th century, interest in witchcraft was renewed through the first studies on the subject and through the Celtic revival, the foundation of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, theosophy, and spiritualism. During the Victorian age, There were thousands of spiritualists, but they were often criticized as unholy and credulous believers in their communication with the dead. It is important to point out, however, that spiritualism wanted to prove the existence of the afterlife, whereas necromancers had very specific and different purposes. In the 20th century, witchcraft evolved into a new direction with the publication of Murray's The Witch Cult in 1921, which popularized the idea that concreted the connection between medieval witchcraft and pre-Christian paganism, and the invention of modern Wiccan by Gardner in the 1940s. Today, most use magic to heal or in some developmental way, either for personal or social development. Attempting to raise the dead is not contemplated anymore in the practice of contemporary witchcraft, at least not officially and legally. Many studies on witchcraft and necromancy have been published since the 1970s, mainly by persons who practice magic themselves. In the 1972 Book of Black Magic, Arthur Edward Wade categorizes white and black magic as overlapping in their ill, evil, and frivolous uses. In his examination of the 17th century sources on black magic, Wade describes the various garments, instruments such as wands, staffs, and daggers, talismans, and characters, as well as the planetary influences that are part of the preambles and the rituals. Christian Days, The Witch's Book of the Dead, published in 2011, similarly examines the various rituals and practices from the ancient times, modern magic, recipes, including spirit powder, and tools such as chalices and cauldrons. He considers necromancy as the communication with the dead through divination, dreams, and ghost haunting. What my research has, however, found out is that the representation of necromancy in film and on TV is actually based on the practice of rituals that involve blood and human sacrifice, as in its earlier manifestations. These, as we shall see now, are instrumental, whether the films belong to the fantasy or the horror genre. To the they are instrumental to the development of the plot, the introduction of an adversary for the good characters, or the creation of a frightening atmosphere.
Recording in progress.
In the film The Adventures of Hercules, the gods resurrect King Minos as an adversary to the titular hero by killing another man and pouring his blood onto the skeleton. In Disney's The Black Cauldron, 1985, the evil King Cornelius retrieves the titular magical object in order to resurrect an army of dead warriors to destroy the entire world. The sequence specifically uses visuals that reprise the typical medieval atmosphere linked to horror in Gothic stories of the 18th century. In Karl the Conqueror, an ancient sorceress is resurrected from her sarcophagus after a ritual consisting in the recital of magic words and the use of symbols. The reign of the lascivious, red-haired witch is said to bring about an apocalypse of darkness. Necromancy is, therefore, the narrative expedient for the introduction of the story's villain. In the 2011 version of Conan the Barbarian, necromancy is performed by the antagonist near the end of the narrative in order to resurrect his witch wife and begin a reign of terror on Earth. In The House with a Clock in Its Walls, The young protagonist is tricked by an impostor into using a spell from a book on necromancy hidden in a locked drawer, and, to convince a friend of his of the reality of magic, performs the spell in a cemetery and reanimates a corpse, which is a frightening occasion for the two boys. Such a corpse becomes the main antagonist in the second part of the film. Necromancy is here presented as dangerous and forbidden. In the 2023 Dungeons and Dragons, the protagonists reanimate a series of corpses in the cemetery in order to obtain some information about a mystical weapon. The sequence is, however, based on humor, as the corpses do not want to be reanimated and they are forced to live until they reply to 3 questions. The main case of necromancy depicted in the cinematic and TV genre of fantasy is found in the 5 Mythica films, whose female protagonist discovers to be a necromancer. Her powers derive from the absorption of the surrounding people's vital essence and allow her to communicate telepathically with other necromancers. She uses such powers only when forced by the circumstances, on which occasions her eyes become completely black and her face is stained with dark spots. Much interesting is also the case of The Hobbit, whose narrative's chief antagonist, Sauron, is initially identified only as a necromancer by the wizard Ragadast the Brown. Spoken to in terms of fear, doubt, and suspect, the necromancer's magic is defined when Ragadast affirms that a dark power dwells in the abandoned fortress of Dol Guldur, such as I have never felt before. It is the shadow of an ancient horror, one that can summon the spirit of the dead. From out of darkness, a necromancer has come. The scene itself is displayed through the use of several horror tropes, such as the scared reaction of the character, the dismal atmosphere, the use of high and low angles, and the sudden life-threatening appearance of the enemy. Several characters, especially Gandalf, are afraid of the proofs affirming the existence of the necromancer and the return of the ancient enemy. Theirs is an epistemological fear, as is the case of monsters in Gothic fiction. The subsequent investigation on the matter leads first to the evidence indicating the disappearance of the corpses that have been reanimated. This is one of the few scenes in which Gandalf is depicted as frightened and not as self-confident as he usually is. And then to the fight against the Nazgul by the most legendary heroes of the entire saga created by Tolkien. Of course, necromancy is also the subject of several horror films, starting with the 1972 Necromancy with Orson Welles as the leader of a sect who wants to bring his son back from death. In order to do this, he hosts a couple and uses the mediumistic powers of the woman. Reiterated throughout the film is that it takes a life to give someone's life back. Witchcraft is presented as seductive and condescending for its practitioners, and the protagonist experiences several terrifying visions of the bloody ritual she is to perform, which involves the sacrifice of her own boyfriend. In the film The Midnight Hour, 1985, a group of American students unknowingly reads an ancient curse that resurrects the dead from the local cemetery at Halloween night. This film, however, portrays the rise of the dead in some humorous situations. In Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, the practice of necromancy on the part of the evil witch stepmother leads to the resurrection of the narrative's main villain, the Headless Horseman, and the commitment of a series of brutal murders. Differently from other fictional accounts of necromancy, in this case, the use of black magic is motivated by the will to obtain a personal gain, revenge, and an inheritance, in a sort of inversion of the dispossession of inheritance suffered by the female characters in some 18th century Gothic novels. The narrative solution is achieved once the ritual of necromancy is inverted, that is, when the skull is returned to the headless horseman and the evil sorceress who sold her soul to the devil is punished by him. Finally, The Haunted in Connecticut interprets necromancy as the violation of corpses, which has been perpetrated by the previous owner of the house in order to increase the power of his son as a medium. It is witnessed by its new tenants through visions, dreams, and apparitions. The film relies on the trope of objection, as it presents many gory, frightening images of body parts and white-eyed corpses desecrated with writings carved on their bodies that haunt the protagonist and his family. Necromancy as the mere resurrection of the dead, not entailing an elaborate ritual or the sacrifice of human blood, is performed in the episodes of TV series such as Visitors, Teenage Ninja Turtles, Game of Thrones, and The Untamed. In the series Angel and True Blood, the necromancers are respectively a warlock and a witch with control over the dead, and therefore ghosts and vampires, who are at the end defeated by the narrative's hero or heroes. The cases of Supernatural, The X-Files, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and The Order instead involve the performance of a ritual. In Supernatural and Sabrina, it is practiced to resuscitate a loved one. In The Order, it involves the recovery of a witch's health from cancer. And in The X-Files, a religious man resurrects 4 members of a sect to initiate the apocalypse. In his 1834 book, Lives of the Necromancer, William Godwin, father of Mary Shelley, argues to violate the sepulchre for the purpose of unholy spells and operations, as we read of in the annals of witchcraft, cannot fail to be exceedingly shocking. To call up the spirits of the departed after they have fulfilled the task of life and are consigned to their final sleep is sacrilegious. Such a negative judgment and consideration of necromancy and its association with the magical rise of the dead has been lost in the actual practices of contemporary witches, but it has been perpetrated in popular culture through cinema and television. That is what has been born for me as a paper on the resuscitation of the dead by magic, as I thought it would have been practiced in the actual history of the human species, has only been actually perpetrated in film and television, as we saw, for different purposes, both in the genres of fantasy and horror. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye-bye.